Well, hello everybody, and an extremely warm welcome to my channel. My name is Louise Savage of Louise Savage Muses. A warm welcome back if you're a returning viewer, and an equally warm welcome if you are viewing my channel for the very first time. So today I'm here to talk about an extremely personal book, and it's a book that fits in beautifully with it being non-fiction November, because it is a memoir. And it's called Lifting the Lid on a Baby Boomer's Memory Box by Bob Perry, One Boy's Life and Times. And the reason that this is such a personal book is because it's actually written by my brother-in-law, my husband's brother. I have to think about that relationship for a minute. And this wasn't a book that we were aware that he was writing. It's his very first published book, and he sort of quietly got on with writing this, and then sort of surprised us all by very modestly mentioning a year or so ago that he had written a book and that it had been taken up by a publisher who publishes I think it's called Novum Press, who publish works by new authors or unpublished authors. And of course, you know, we were incredibly curious about this, and I asked him if he would send me a PDF, whatever, but he's a very modest person. He didn't want us to see the book until it was in its final project. You can see that it's been read by myself and my husband, which is why it's sort of quite battered on the edges. So my brother-in-law Bob grew up in the West Midlands, in Walsall, in a very sort of modern for the time housing estate, and he's written this memoir about the first 10 years of his life, and he sort of almost, I think, wrote it sort of by accident. Started it during lockdown. He had he's retired, he had a lot of time to reflect, and he wrote it for his grandchildren. He has two grandsons, and he wanted to share with them the experience of growing up as a very ordinary, he refers to him quite often in this as an unremarkable boy, in the 1950s and 60s in a sort of very working class area, with all the sort of aftermath of the Second World War and the First World War, actually, the echoes of that. And I had, I know him as this very jolly, very hilarious, it's very difficult to have a serious conversation with my brother-in-law. So I suppose my expectations with this book were quite limited, really. And what astonished me was that I absolutely loved it, and I think it's really beautifully written. And what he does very cleverly is he tells the story of his very unremarkable life. So my mother and father-in-law feature, of course. He tells their stories and their parents, and they are so recognisably them. He's captured them brilliantly. But also I've learnt a lot about them that I didn't know before. So, for example, I didn't know that my mother-in-law had kept down 2 jobs that she'd worked during the week, and also had a Saturday job down the road. I wasn't aware of that at all. So just little details about their lives that I didn't know. But as I was reading this, it was much more for me. I thought I'd be reading it as a way of sort of getting to know my husband's history, and of course it's my children's history too. I feel really emotional about this book, because I think what an amazing thing for them that they can have this as a record of their family's past, and something that hopefully we'll be able to pass down or they'll be able to pass down from one generation to another. So it's a very, as I say, it's really personal, it's really special. But what he's managed to do superbly well is he tells his life, and he writes. His writing is beautiful. It's really clear. His explanations. So he there are moments where it's quite literary, but equally and quite amusing and funny, because, as I said, he's a very witty person. But he also manages to interweave the history of the 1950s and 60s. So in this book, he explains about the Cuban Missile Crisis. He explains about the Suez Canal. Now, these are all things that I was aware of, but I can't say I've ever really understood them that well. And what he seems to have the facility to do, so he'll write about something that's happening in his childhood. You know, maybe it's England winning the World Cup or something like that. And then he'll link it to some historical event. So his whole narrative of his early life is very, very carefully framed around the history of the time, and that it's really, really informative. I genuinely learnt an awful lot about that period of history, or at least he helped me to understand those moments in history much, much better. And of course, the ordinary life is one that is rarely recorded. And although he refers to himself as being unremarkable, it doesn't mean that it's dull. You know, a lot of the things that were happening at the time were really interesting. I mean, he tells stories about, you know, what holidays were like for that generation of people. The idea that you would never go abroad, you know, that was sort of something that was only for the supremely wealthy. He describes, you know, he really made, I mean, I grew up in a very, well, I didn't grow up that far away, but in a very different rural environment. And yet we used to go on holiday to the east coast of England. We used to all pile in the car and go off to Filey or Skegness or Mablethorpe or wherever it might be. And he describes that. He describes the family going off and going to Butlins and what it was like there. But he also, one of the things that really, really, you know how the sense of smell can really trigger nostalgia. He mentioned the fact that as you were driving towards Skegness or wherever, that coast, they grew lots of cabbages, and there would be the smell of cabbage in the air because it'd be summer and it'd be warm. And I'd completely forgotten that. And there are lovely moments where they decide, you know, that they're going to be really, really adventurous and go south rather than going east for a holiday, because of course the Midlands, where he was growing up in the UK, is the most landlocked part of the country. You're furthest from the coast. So they decide to go south, and his father, my father-in-law, has a 3-wheeler car. I don't know if any of you can remember those, but they were very, very unstable. So they set out on this journey to, I think it's Weston-super-Mare, and the motorways, of course, in those days were very quiet, thankfully. And because they'd got to cram 2 children and 2 adults into this 3-wheeler, which was tiny, there was very little room for any luggage at all. And in those days, you took all your food with you because you would cook when you were on holiday because you couldn't afford to eat out. And they set off on this, and they get to the motorway, and his dad's put the suitcase on a roof rack on the top of a 3-wheeler, which is a really unstable car. And they just end up capsizing on the motorway and having to be rescued and go back home. The holiday never happens. So it's just full of those wonderful sort of incidents from that period that are rapidly becoming, you know, the dim and distant past. So yeah, I was just bowled away by this, and I had very few expectations because we barely knew he was even writing this book. And it's made me, what's the word? It's really encouraged me. I've always done little bits of writing, but I've never actually set out to write a whole work of literature. And his attitude and the way that he has managed to create this has really inspired me to write. I've been writing quite a bit in the week or so since I read this book, and I think it's almost given me permission to sort of say to myself, look, you know, you don't have to write something that's going to be publishable, but what you can do is write down your reflections and your thoughts and your ideas about the world, and maybe at some point they might at the very least be passed on to somebody in your family, to my children, so that they can get a sense of the way the world looked from my perspective when you know, in the future. I think it's renewed my connection with the written word, and it's made me realize, I mean, I'm conscious all the time that non-fiction is passing on a shared experience very often that the reader cannot have. And of course we can't, you know, the grandsons that this book is written for can't travel back to the past and stand in Bob's shoes and see the world, and or his parents' shoes and see the world from their point of view. But this book will bring them very close to that experience. So this is going to become an extremely treasured possession. I have, of course, bought copies for all my children for Christmas. Don't tell them. It's fine. I don't think they watch the channel. So yeah, I just wanted to really, really share not just the book, but what a joy this and a privilege it feels to hold this in my hands. And you know, I don't think Bob will ever watch this, but it's a public way of thanking him for what he's done. So take care, everybody. And if you've got personal stories, if you've got memoirs in your family or whatever, please share your experiences of them, because you can see it's really moved me emotionally. And I think this is going to become the most important book in my library. Take care, everybody.